Let's go to sleep first and talk about why, specifically when it comes to brain health, we need to optimize that.
The way that I think about this is that if stimulus is the primary driver of cognitive function, which I believe it is in many ways, then the time that the brain adapts and responds to that stimulus is during sleep primarily. I mean, also like to a lesser extent during periods where we're just not doing things with our brain. There are examples with meditation and mindfulness, or just sitting there being bored. When you're sort of the cognitive load is much lower. That's when the brain starts to adapt and respond. So it's the same as if I'm going to go to the gym. I don't get stronger in the gym. I get stronger when I recover afterwards, right? And when I sleep afterwards. And the brain is essentially the same. So during sleep is when the brain starts to decide the final connections that are made, the synapses that are either developed or the synapses that are removed. And it's a dynamic process. We're constantly making and removing synapses in the brain, like all of us, all the time. But when we sleep, based on those new synapses or the synapses we've decided to keep from a certain stimulus, sleep is when that's cemented. It's like this is now the pattern of connection that we have based on this stimulus, and then that's what helps us retain that memory or that new skill that we've developed. At the same time, sleep, we've sort of increasingly been finding, and by we I mean like the research community in general, is the time when we do all these other like repair and maintenance processes in the brain. So when we stimulate the brain, just like when we stimulate our muscles, we upregulate things like autophagy, the recycling of proteins, sort of getting rid of junky stuff that isn't really working properly. That continues and is sort of finished during sleep, as is all the waste clearance that we get. So there's something called the glymphatic system, which is essentially just like all the fluid that flows through the brain around all the cells, and it's driven by the pulses of your vascular system, of like the blood vessels in the brain. That kind of like shifts. It's one of the and then when we breathe as well, helps shift this fluid through the brain. But that fluid expands, and sort of the flow increases when we're asleep. So it's kind of like the pressure washer kind of like hosing down the concrete pad of your driveway to kind of clean everything out. That happens during sleep. So all the proteins and other metabolites and things that build up when our brains are working hard during the day, that gets cleared out. So all of that responding to and processing all the stuff that we did during the day, that gets consolidated when we sleep, as well as clearing everything out, and then we reset a lot of the systems in the brain so that we can then take in a whole bunch of new experiences the next day. And that's a critical part. But then sort of more, right, that's the kind of the mechanistic and biological explanation. But if we think about what's really important, or some of the important aspects of our brain, it includes our ability to focus and engage. And we know that drops off when we're sleep deprived. So if you don't sleep well one night, or especially several nights in a row. Actually, our brains are pretty good at dealing with a night or two of poor sleep. We tend to like catastrophize and we don't sleep well. Oh my God, I didn't sleep. My brain's going to be terrible today. But actually, that's usually not true. And it's more driven by the fact that we think we're going to perform poorly because we didn't sleep, whereas actually our brains would have been fine. But over long periods of time, sleep deprivation does decrease our ability to focus and pay attention, but it also decreases our ability to connect with other people. We become less empathetic. We're more likely to respond negatively to something or imagine that somebody else is doing something for a negative reason. And that then impairs our social connection that we already talked about, why that was so important. So for both like the biological as well as the sociological reasons, like sleep is this really critical input to long-term brain health.
And for you specifically, when you're leading up to sleep at night, what are the things you do to enhance that?
My days are fairly well structured. I'm lucky that gets to be the case. It's not the case for everybody. But I usually sort of work backwards. So I know when I'm going to wake up. At 6 a.m., the dogs want to wake up and go outside to pee. Like rain or shine every day. So I know I'm going to wake up at 6 a.m. If I want to sleep for sort of 7 to 8 hours, which is a good range for like sort of if we had to be like an average amount of sleep that people should get, it's about 7 hours. That the range is like 6 to 10 for one individual to another. So don't take 7 as like a thing you have to hit. But if I want to get like 7 to 8 hours, then I need to make sure that I have 8 to 9 hours of sleep opportunity, right? So I need to be in bed 9 hours before I'm going to wake up. So I need to be in bed at 9, which is generally pretty close to how things go. And then in the run up to that, there's sort of like a winding down period. Over an hour or two, lights get turned off. There's like not doing work on computers or phones. My wife likes, gets like a cup of herbal tea before bed. That's part of the wind down routine. I like blue light blocking glasses. It's probably at this point just like placebo effect. It's like the glasses go on and my brain's like, it's bedtime. I've kind of conditioned myself to half an hour before my brain knows it's bedtime. Of course, like bright lights and these other things can suppress melatonin production, that can delay sleep onset, but some of it's also just like building of the routine. And then sort of like the final bit, particularly for the sleep preparation, is that some people find they don't sleep as well if they've eaten a very heavy meal or they've eaten a meal right before bed, or if they've exercised right before bed. So I exercise at least 4 or 5 hours before bed, and I eat dinner like 3 hours before I go to bed. Other people, particularly if they're very high volume athletes, I've done a lot of work with professional athletes. If they need a very high volume of calories, then they may, right, if they eat their last meal 3 hours before bed, then they're hungry at bedtime and then they sleep worse. So they might need a snack before bed. So it's just figuring out what you need and then having that kind of run-in period.
So you talked about the blue light blocking glasses. On the other end of the spectrum, when you get up in the morning with the dogs, do you try and get light in the eyes to set your circadian rhythm?
Yes, as much as possible. That's not possible every morning. Just like if I immediately have to go into work, like some of the work I do is in the lab in the basement, and I'm in there at 6 a.m. and until like 1 p.m. or something. If that's the case, I'm not going to worry about it. It is what it is. But on the days when I can, like right now we had a nice sunny day we're having a nice sunny day in Seattle. If, before we jumped on this podcast, it was about sort of 9 a.m. I took the dogs outside. We stood around, got some sun, and, as much as possible, trying to get bright light in the eyes in the morning to help set that rhythm, I think is important. But again, like I said, the circadian rhythm doesn't just come on one day at a time, right? You can sort of do things that you can do most days, and then if it doesn't happen on a given day, it's no big deal. You just sort of like, what you do most of the time is what makes the difference.
And just to clarify, we're not talking about going out and staring right at the sun.
No,
just being out
in
the sunlight, and that light naturally is going to get in the eyes.
Mainly because the brightness of light that you get indoors, even on a cloudy day, doesn't match up to the light that you get outside. So even if it's cloudy in the middle of the morning, you're getting a lot more light than you think compared to just like being inside. So don't need to stare at the sun. It doesn't even need to be sunny. You can still have that effect.
Okay, let's come to the work piece. You quickly mentioned work there. When you have control, because of what you know about the brain, how do you set up your day to get the most out of your brain? Do you have certain blocks of time you like to work in, taking breaks, naps? Share how you become most productive and focused.
It's a great question because nowadays, most of us who are knowledge workers, right? Our productivity comes from our brains, which is probably the majority of people in westernized society at this point. There's just this like continual onslaught of things that we're being asked to do, and often on somebody else's timescale and not our own, right? Your boss is like, you got to do this right now, and you get the email notification or the Slack notification or the Teams notification or whatever, and they continuously come in. That is pretty much the worst case scenario for actually being able to do any productive work. So sometimes you have to respond, of course, but a better way to do it, and this is what I do, is really break your day down into chunks of different kinds of work. So a nice example of this comes from a friend and colleague of mine, Dr. James Hewitt, and he talks about cognitive gears. So basically, there are 3 levels of work that your brain can do, approximately, like high gear, middle gear, low gear. Low gear is the rest and recovery. It's when we're not doing anything, sleep, an actual lunch break, going for a walk outside, whatever, just like something where you're not doing anything with your brain, including not switching from Instagram to email to whatever. What most of us spend our time doing is middle gear, what he calls middle gear, which is task switching, quote unquote, multitasking. It's on a Zoom call while you're doing your email. It's trying to write an email while somebody else is messaging you on something else. It's picking up Instagram while you're on a podcast. I'm obviously not doing that, but it's that kind of trying to do multiple things at the time and switching back and forth, and having to switch your attention because of somebody else's intrusion on your attention with notifications and that kind of stuff. So of course you need to respond to email, you need to do this kind of work, but it's best to fit that into a time when your brain is going to be less likely to do really high quality deep work, and every individual has their certain ultradian or ultradian, depending on how you pronounce it, rhythm. So across a day, our energy levels naturally fluctuate every sort of 1 to 2 hours ish. It may even be broader than that for some people, but you'll probably know there's some period of the time when your brain works best. This is the time I feel good. Right. That's the time when notifications should be switched off, emails should be shut down, and just like for like an hour or 2 at least, right at the peak, you get stuff done. And when you can do that, everything else just becomes much, much simpler. Then after that, ideally, so that's your high gear work. That's what James would call your high gear work. Then, right, we talked about stimulus, hard work, using the brain. After that, it needs to recover. If you can get like a lunch break or a walk or something after that, it doesn't have to be a lot, but just some time to, come back down and reset. That's great. And then, so I'm kind of giving you my version. In the morning is when I feel best. That's when I do my high quality work. I try not to have meetings. I try not to do other stuff. Try to write my book. And then after that, right, there's a bit of a break. I'll have some lunch, take the dogs for a walk, whatever. And then early afternoon, that's when I get a little bit of my kind of less energy. It's not a slump, but it's just like I'm less kind of really focused. So then that's when I'll clear out emails. That's when I'll address other stuff that just requires like little bits of work here or there. It doesn't really require like really focused attention. And then often people will get a second bump later in the afternoon, sometimes in the early evening. If you can take advantage of that without it negatively affecting your bedtime, that's fine too. But just think about matching the type of work that you're trying to do. And I'm kind of assuming 2 big buckets. One is focused work where you really need on your own to focus and get something done. And then there's all the other like odds and jobs and emails and messages and that kind of stuff. And just align them to your periods of best attention and focus, and that'll be different for you than what it is for me. Just you'll know when you feel best to do that kind of work, and then you don't have to sacrifice anything in particular. You've just kind of aligned your time accordingly, and as much as you can, right, try not to get meetings and these other things. Like meetings are great to go into like your middle gear box, right? It doesn't require, it requires your attention, but it's not like really deep focused thinking type work. So if you're able to do that, I think that's the best kind of setup to be as productive and least stressed about the work that you have to do in a given day.
If you enjoyed that clip, you're going to want to head over here and catch the full episode. I'll see you over there.
This traditional idea that eating lots of carbs, that spikes lots of insulin, and then that causes insulin resistance, in and of itself, I don't think that that's actually what's happening. As people become metabolically unhealthy, or they become insulin resistant, there does seem to be this